After licensing the rights of Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back to Parker Brothers, George Lucas was excited to expand into other areas of entertainment, and video games was the obvious choice. So in the spring of 1982, Atari offered $1 million to Lucasfilm to create their own games group, grabbing also the rights for developing games based on the Star Wars movie franchise, which would last till early 90s. Therefore, by May 1st of 1982, George Lucas founded Lucasfilm Games, next door with special effects division Industrial Light and Magic, as part of his own Lucasfilm movie company. Peter Langston was seen as a Unix guru inside the computer division at Lucasfilm, and was the obvious choice to add the brand new games division. The entire division was more into technology than video games, and their work on the entertaining aspects of technology was seen as research and development. George Lucas didn't have much interest in video games and barely showed up at the Skywalker Ranch. But when he did, he would transmit confidence to the teams behind Lucasfilm titles, giving just the necessary feedback. 1990 came along with a reorganization of the Lucas companies, and thus Lucasfilm Games became part of the LucasArts Entertainment Company, along with Industrial Light and Magic and Skywalker Sound. Later, Industrial Light and Magic would merge with Skywalker Sound into Lucas Digital Limited, and LucasArts, the official and final name of the games division. They moved to newer and bigger facilities and also started publishing their own gaming magazine, The Adventurer, that would feature announcements of their upcoming titles and interviews with the developers, and would be around till 1996. In 1991, and for the first time, the license to develop video games based on the Star Wars movie franchise was finally in the hands of its rightful owner. So, based on the first two movies of the Star Wars franchise, came two titles for Sega and Nintendo 8-bit systems: Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. This last one was exclusive to the NES and the Game Boy. If it wasn't for a license for development of video games based in the Star Wars universe being in the hands of Atari during the 80s, we would probably never see amazing, original and groundbreaking titles like Ball Blazer, Rescue on Fractalus, Labyrinth, Maniac Mansion, Zack McCracken, The Secret of Monkey Island, etc. By the end of '92, Super Star Wars was released for the Super Nintendo, an amazing run-and-gun platform game that features multiple playable characters and in where we could also fly an X-Wing and drive a land speeder. It was the Super Nintendo equivalent of the 1991 Star Wars NES game. 1993 would bring amazing titles for MS-DOS players. It was, for me, a year of transition when I embraced PC gaming with arms wide open. I didn't have an hard drive on my Amiga, so I became tired of the dreadful disk swapping that recent games obliged. This year saw the dawn and rise of the talkie CD-ROM era that allowed adventure game characters to actually speak their own words of dialogue during gameplay.
She can go on forward.
All those years developing combat flight simulators came to fruition in 1993. The team behind Battlehawks 1942, Their Finest Hour and Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe gained the amount of experience needed to finally bring Star Wars X-Wing, one of the first titles that I played on my brand new IBM PC and ended up completely addicted to it. The feeling of being at the controls of an X-Wing, Y-Wing and A-Wing, performing all sorts of missions and engaging TIE fighters, was mind-boggling. Even now, X-Wing is so damn enjoyable to play. It was the first Star Wars title to also be published by LucasArts and one of the first simulation games to include 3D polygon graphics for spaceships, instead of less detailed bitmap graphics that were normally used in flight simulators. It went on being one of the best-selling PC games of 1993. And by June, the release of Super Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back for the Super Nintendo, another huge hit on the console, which improved upon the 1991 release for the NES. It was the sequel to Super Star Wars and, as according to the movie in which it was based, introduced force powers and Luke's ability to block attacks and deflect blaster incoming fire using his trustful lightsaber. Darth Vader will also make its appearance in this amazing game. The Japanese version would only arrive in December and PAL regions would receive the game only by February of 1994. By the end of '93, another Star Wars title saw the light of day, Rebel Assault, that took advantage of the CD-ROM fever that seemed to have contaminated the industry. Full motion video was emerging and was seen as something from the future, and everyone wanted to have a slice of it. The PC and Mac CD-ROM, the Sega CD and the 3DO was where we could find Rebel Assault. It failed to reach the standards of other Star Wars titles, but all the CD frenzy of the time turned it into a classic, selling more than 1 million copies. Super Star Wars: Return of the Jedi for the Super Nintendo, and unlike its predecessors, received a couple of bad reviews from specialized press and at the same time praise for the amazing musical score and the excellent graphics. But that didn't stop it from being awarded by Electronic Gaming Monthly as the Best Movie to Game Award of 1994 and a year later, Best Game Gear title of 1995. And by July, the sequel to X-Wing arrived, Star Wars TIE Fighter. This time around we could fight for the Empire under the command of Darth Vader himself and other Imperial commanders. It features an amazing and compelling story filled with tense political intrigue that amazed critics and players alike, ending up being re-released a year later in a collector's CD-ROM edition with enhanced Super VGA graphics, cutscenes and brand new voiceovers. It was also the first Star Wars video game to take advantage of LucasArts' iMuse system to create such an amazing and involving musical environment. Also during 1994, a package of Star Wars screensavers on CD-ROM was placed on store shelves that offered, as said, a bunch of Star Wars related screensavers for Windows and Macintosh, like the Cantina, Darth Vader, the jump to hyperspace, posters from A New Hope, blueprints of the Millennium Falcon, etc. The mid-90s were huge in technological advancements, with brand new consoles in the horizon and 3D accelerated graphics for the PC that would allow the creation of even more immersive game experiences that LucasArts could and should use on future story-driven adventures based on their movie franchises, bringing its rich worlds to life in such a way that no one had ever seen and experienced before. While playing around with those new consoles and new hardware, LucasArts began experimenting new genres. So they came up with my favorite FPS ever made, Star Wars Dark Forces, released for the PC and Mac. It broke so many barriers and overcame a bunch other obstacles, improving the Doom formula to a higher level. LucasArts' first venture into the FPS genre couldn't have been more successful than it was. Dark Forces contributed to the evolution of the genre, and for the first time we could be inside and completely absorbed in the Star Wars universe and in a real-time 3D environment. We play as a former Imperial officer who joined the rebellion to try to stop the Empire's Dark Trooper project. A year later it was also released for the PlayStation, but had severe framerate issues that stopped it from being as successful as the DOS and Macintosh versions. 1995 wouldn't end without another Star Wars title, so by November, Star Wars Rebel Assault 2: The Hidden Empire was available for PC, PlayStation and Mac. It came 2 years after the first of the series, bringing back the wonders of the full motion video technology. It was similar to its predecessor in all respects, with 15 missions and even the chance to fly the Millennium Falcon. It was seen by the press as an interactive movie with brand new Star Wars live-action video footage, in where we only had to move the stick around and press a button at a certain moment to advance in the story. By December, LucasArts makes their return to the Star Wars franchise with Star Wars Shadows of the Empire for the Nintendo 64 and a year later also for PC. Its story is set between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and was LucasArts' very first title for Nintendo's brand new 64-bit console that arrived a couple of months prior. The game featured many unique locations and vehicles, just like this snowspeeder on the ice planet of Hoth, all in glorious full 3D. Mos Eisley in Tatooine and the sewers of the Imperial City are also featured in this project that started back in 1994 and was one of the most stressful games to make, cause LucasArts wanted to release it right after the official launch of the Nintendo 64 in North America. Off the record, 1997 was a year of astounding releases, so it was perfectly obvious that other titles would evaporate in thin air. Another title from LucasArts Desktop Adventures arrived also in March for Windows, Star Wars Yoda Stories. It also came 2 years later in December of 1999 for the Game Boy Color, and we get to play as Luke Skywalker completing his training with Yoda to become a Jedi. Just like in Indiana Jones and his desktop adventures, the missions are procedurally generated so that we get a new objective every time you start the game. In April came one of the most anticipated games, Star Wars X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, exclusive for PC, that would later also receive the Balance of Power expansion pack. What was awesome about this new title was, finally, the introduction of the online multiplayer space combat, the ultimate battle between the Alliance and the Empire, in where up to 7 players could cooperatively play over LAN and 3 over the internet. The Balance of Power expansion, released later in the year, by December to be more precise, brought new ships and an extensive single-player campaign for those that had limited access to the World Wide Web. But the best was reserved for later in the year. Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2 was released for PC, the sequel to the groundbreaking Dark Forces from 1995. Needless to say that it became another of my favorite first-person shooters ever created, that features a brand new 3D engine and sees the return of Kyle Katarn, now as a Jedi, with the main goal of stopping not 1 nor 2, but 7 Dark Jedi from unleashing the powers of an hidden Jedi burial ground. While playing, we're constantly challenged on picking a side, the light or the dark side of the Force. An expansion pack arrived on February of '98, Mysteries of the Sith, that included 15 multiplayer maps that allowed up to 8 players online or over LAN. It also offered newer Force powers and a new single-player story set 5 years after the events of the main story of Dark Forces 2. By the end of the year, it was quite weird to see a fighting game coming from LucasArts Studios. Even more weird was that it's a fighting game with Star Wars characters in it. Star Wars Masters of Terraskasi was released exclusively for the PlayStation, that even had the help of specialists from Industrial Light and Magic to create the animations for the characters using motion capture. Sadly, it's considered one of the worst fighting games ever made. 1998 started with a real-time strategy title, Star Wars Rebellion, also known as Supremacy in the UK and Ireland, in where players battled the control of the galaxy as a commander of the Galactic Empire or the Rebel Alliance. The choice was ours. Star Wars Behind the Magic was an interactive multimedia CD-ROM that would arrive by September of '98. It included rare stills and footage from the original Star Wars and also a sneak peek into the Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. LucasArts would also venture into the edutainment business, creating their own subsidiary for educational purposes, Lucas Learning, and their first product was Star Wars DroidWorks, an educational adventure that teaches the player about energy, magnetism, simple machines, light, force and motion. It was so well received by critics and parents that ended up winning at least 16 awards from November of 1998 until October of 2001. 1998 would end with another huge hit, Star Wars Rogue Squadron for the Nintendo 64 and PC, being the first of 3 games in the Rogue Squadron series. In this one, co-developed by LucasArts and Factor 5, were invited to be Luke Skywalker himself and take part in huge X-Wing dogfights throughout the galaxy as a member of the elite group known as Rogue Squadron. A spiritual presence of Shadows of the Empire is seen in the Snowspeeder level in a newer and fresher way, and it was one of the first titles to take advantage of the Nintendo 64 RAM pack, allowing 640 by 480 display resolution instead of the native 320 by 240. By that time, LucasArts were extremely pleased with their collaboration with German developer Factor 5 and used Factor 5's brand new engine for Rogue Squadron, an engine that could draw large terrain maps. That level from Shadows of the Empire, in where we controlled a Snowspeeder during the Battle of Hoth, was the main inspiration for Rogue Squadron. They had also to ask permission for Nintendo to use the memory expansion pack to achieve higher graphical quality, cause according to Nintendo, the expansion pack should be used solely for hardware peripherals. However, Iguana Entertainment had already used the expansion pack for that same purpose on Turok 2 Seeds of Evil, so Nintendo had to also allow Factor 5 to use it for that intent. Strange was that Lucasfilm Limited, George Lucas Movie Company, wouldn't grant access to the Star Wars library of sound effects. Instead, they provided Factor 5 with really low rate files that sounded horrible. So they ended up using sounds captured from VHS tapes, and along with their own sound drivers, were able to immerse the player in this incredible audio-visual experience with over 80 minutes of high-quality stereo sound. In the end, the game's producer stated it sold about 100 times better than anybody expected.
Nice shot!
1999 began with one of my favorite LucasArts Star Wars titles and for me, the pinnacle of the X-Wing series. Star Wars X-Wing Alliance. Exclusive to the PC, it offered enhanced graphics and fully 3D cockpits, with more than 50 missions in the single-player campaign and 5 for multiplayer action. The most fondly remembered moments were the ability to hyperjump from one area to another and to fly the Millennium Falcon in the assault on the second Death Star, just like we saw in the movie Return of the Jedi. And right before Star Wars Episode 1 came in April, the first 2 titles based on the Phantom Menace. Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace and Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. This last one offered super fast and super addictive gameplay in 21 different race courses across 8 different worlds and was generally well received by the gaming press and players, being also the very first time that LucasArts developed a video game for the Dreamcast. As for the game that shares the exact title as the movie, it was available for PC and PlayStation and developed by Big Ape Productions for LucasArts, receiving really poor reviews but ending up as a bestseller in the UK. It followed closely the movie's plot, a sort of interactive way of replaying the movie, and we get to play it as Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, Queen Amidala and Captain Panaka. An insider's guide to Star Wars Episode 1 was also released for PC and Mac, which featured the making of the original prequel and as well an interactive behind the scenes at the creation of the Phantom Menace. By October, Star Wars Pit Droids for PC arrived from Lucas Learning Limited, a puzzle game intended for kids that even older Star Wars fans will be addicted to. The detailed graphics, the complex gameplay and its catchy soundtrack are the ingredients that makes it an extremely fun puzzler to play with kids, or simply by ourselves. 2000 saw the release of a bunch other Star Wars related titles, mainly for consoles. Even so, the year started with a PC exclusive, Star Wars Force Commander, a 3D real-time strategy title that gave players the ability to command troops in massive battles. Soon after came the first console exclusive title of the year, Star Wars Episode 1 Jedi Power Battles for PlayStation, Dreamcast and Game Boy Advance. It's a simple action-driven adventure game with a mix of platform and beat-em-up action in where we get to play as a Jedi and defeat once and for all Darth Maul on one last battle that takes place on Naboo. The final couple of months also saw the release of two other Star Wars titles: Star Wars Demolition for PlayStation and Dreamcast, and Star Wars Episode 1 Battle for Naboo for Nintendo 64, followed by a PC port that would arrive only by March of 2001. Star Wars Demolition was developed by LucasArts and Luxoflux using the Vigilante 8 game engine, and it's basically a combat game with those well-known Star Wars vehicles in a contest organized by Jabba the Hutt. As for Battle for Naboo, it was the return of Factor 5 to the Star Wars universe, bringing back that Rogue Squadron amazing feeling of aerial combat. The N64 original version was another victory both for Factor 5 and LucasArts, but the PC port was met with huge critics on the controls and the poor graphical quality. 2001 started with Star Wars Starfighter, LucasArts' first game developed in-house for the PlayStation 2, and by November, in a special edition developed by Secret Level Inc., later acquired by Sega, and as a launch title for Microsoft's first console, the Xbox, that had just arrived in US stores. By January of 2002, it was also released for the PC, but it's better to simply forget this last one. By that time, LucasArts was focused on releasing and conquering the console market, and PC gamers and fans of Star Wars could only be pissed. Back in the 90s, LucasArts was seen as a developer of awesome PC games, but in this new millennium, that idea vanished completely. Even so, the PlayStation original version of Starfighter was a joy to play and a reminder of those amazing titles from the 90s available for PC and Mac owners. Lucas Learning Limited also entered the console market with Star Wars Super Bombad Racing exclusively for the PlayStation 2. Released in April, it would appeal to a younger audience with a sort of Mario Kart style of gameplay, with well-known characters from Star Wars Episode 1, with huge ads that ended up highly criticized by fans of the franchise. Later in the year, LucasArts would try to make amends with fans with the release of Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds for PC and Mac users. It was another real-time strategy game, this time around developed by LucasArts and Ensemble Studios, best known for their highly successful Age of Empires series, built with an enhanced version of the Age of Empires game engine. Fans of Star Wars and of this particular genre were extremely pleased with it, and by May of 2002, 2 days before the release of the next movie, Galactic Battlegrounds received an expansion pack, the Clone Campaigns, that enlarged the game's already huge scope by including large-scale battle scenarios from Star Wars Episode 2 The Clone Wars. 18th of November of 2001 would also remain in video gaming history for two reasons. It was the launch date of the Nintendo GameCube in the US, and also the day when LucasArts, with compliments from Factor 5, released exclusively for that console one of the best Star Wars video games ever made: Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader. It would take us with overwhelming movie-like visuals and astonishing audio environment in full Dolby Pro Logic 2 surround sound during the most famous battles in movie history, like the Death Star trench run and the gigantic conflict in the ice planet of Hoth. 2001 was the year of firsts for LucasArts. The first PS2 game, the first GameCube game, and by December, the first Xbox exclusive game, Star Wars Obi-Wan. However, it was a failed attempt. It was initially intended to be a sequel to Dark Forces 2, but due to unstable performance on PC, it was targeted for the powerful Xbox that was about to be launched in the United States. LucasArts ended up recognizing that the over-reliance on the Star Wars franchise was, as stated, reducing the quality of their final products. So they've announced that future releases would be at least 50% non-related to Star Wars. That statement ended up falling into the ground cause many of those supposed original titles were either unsuccessful or cancelled during development, what consequently and accidentally led to the release of a ton of new Star Wars games that were already in production. So, Star Wars Racer Revenge would arrive in early 2002, developed by Rainbow Studios exclusively for the PlayStation 2, that would allow players to engage in even more gruesome and fearsome pod races than in its predecessor. In this one, we could run opponents into walls and take them out of the race before it was over. Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast followed, also from third-party developers for PC, Mac, Xbox and GameCube, and saw the return of Kyle Katarn in this first-person action game that used the highly popular Quake 3 Arena game engine, climbing its way to the top of the charts and becoming one of the best-selling first-person action games of the year. Along with Jedi Outcast came another console-exclusive title developed by LucasArts themselves, Star Wars Jedi Starfighter for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, and a sequel to Star Wars Starfighter, which included a sneak peek to the new Star Wars Episode 2 movie that would arrive 2 months later. In this one, we could fly the Jedi Starfighter and use Force powers while in the cockpit, across 15 land and space missions, and other 2-player cooperative missions.
You can slice faster than this.
By the end of the year, another 2 console exclusives, Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Bounty Hunter. This last one was developed indoors and also known as Jango Fett in Japan, telling the story of how Jango became the most famous bounty hunter of the Star Wars universe. It was a title in where practically everyone at LucasArts was involved, from industrial light and magic to create the game's CG cinematic sequences and Skywalker sound that provided the game's sound design. As for the Clone Wars, initially available for PS2 and GameCube, we played the role of a Jedi Knight leading the Republic army into the gigantic ground battles of the Clone Wars seen in the movie Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. Soon after came another PC blockbuster, Star Wars Galaxies: An Empire Divided, that later received 3 expansion packs, Jump to Lightspeed, Rage of the Wookiees, and Trials of Obi-Wan. It was the first Star Wars MMORPG developed by Variant Interactive and Sony Online Entertainment, in where we could explore the Star Wars universe and become a Jedi, a smuggler, a ranger, a merchant or a bounty hunter. The game events were set between the end of Episode 4, A New Hope, and Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, including once more the Battle of Hoth, that is such a reference in the Star Wars fictional setting. But the biggest surprise would come after Star Wars Galaxies and from BioWare. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, initially for Xbox and later also for PC. This RPG is set in the Star Wars universe, 4,000 years before the events depicted in Episode 1 movie, takes us through many well-known Star Wars locations, in where we interact with other characters, performing side quests that will influence our path into the light or the dark side of the Force. We can turn our character into a powerful Jedi, a merciless Sith, or something else. It received universal acclaim both for the PC and Xbox versions, winning several awards including Game of the Year 2003. Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy for PC, Mac and Xbox was also another huge hit in 2003, a first and third person shooter developed by Raven Software for home computers and Vicarious Visions for Microsoft's console, and as opposed to Jedi Outcast, we immediately start with a lightsaber, something highly praised by gamers and reviewers. Soon after, the GameCube would receive the highly anticipated exclusive Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike, again developed by Factor 5, that ended up as a huge disappointment, cause players were expecting something bigger after the success of the previous title in the Rogue Squadron series. In this one, we had the ability to leave our fighter and take part in ground battles, and as well enter and pilot many other vehicles in certain missions. However, the best was reserved for later with the release of Star Wars Battlefront, developed by Pandemic Studios initially for PC, Xbox and PlayStation 2. It's a first and third person shooter played basically as a conquest game, and multiplayer over the internet was huge and something quite remarkable, with 64 players simultaneously on both the PC and Mac versions, with also more than 25 usable vehicles. The console versions allow 32 players via GameSpy and Xbox Live. Right after Battlefront came the sequel to Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, subtitled The Sith Lords, developed this time around by Obsidian Entertainment and released firstly for Xbox and later for PC, Mac and Linux. Set 5 years after the events of the first game, it places us in control of an exiled Jedi Knight in a time when the Jedi have been nearly exterminated by the Sith. So our mission is quite simple: gather the remaining forces and defeat the Sith, revealing a dark and obscure amazing plot. Republic Commando for PC and Xbox, their brand new Star Wars related title. An astounding first-person tactical shooter that uses Epic Games' powerful Unreal Engine. Criticized for offering a short experience, it was, on the other hand, praised for its story and combat that are set during the events of the movie Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. 2005 was also the year when their partnership with LEGO made its first steps into the video game business with LEGO Star Wars, the video game, developed by Traveler's Tales and published firstly in March by LucasArts for practically all systems available by then, before and after the premiere of Episode 3, the final chapter of the prequel. It would allow players to relive the events of all three movies from the Star Wars prequel in a LEGO style and oriented for family fun, being extremely well received for that same reason. And by May, when the third movie was finally arriving to cinemas, Star Wars Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith was also released for PC, Xbox, PS2, Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS, that was obviously based in scenes from the movie. Ubisoft Montreal was responsible for the portable versions that were considered the best from the whole bunch. The Collective Inc. developed the other console releases that even had the help of the stunt coordinator and lightsaber trainer from all the three prequel movies, and he even appears in the game as a boss. By October arrived the moment that fans were eagerly waiting: the release of Star Wars Battlefront 2 for PC, Xbox, PS2 and even the PSP. Pandemic Studios returned to the series to create an even greater and immersive experience. It was released alongside the DVD of Revenge of the Sith, and unlike its predecessor, features a more narrative-based campaign along with new vehicles, characters, maps and missions. During these last 2 years, LucasArts went through a profound internal change under the tight belt of Jim Ward, appointed president of LucasArts back in April of 2004, that had shown all his skills marketing the movies Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. George Lucas felt that his games division was putting out too many mediocre titles. Even the most popular ones weren't generating enough revenue to keep LucasArts afloat, So Ward's first actions were to cancel a few games already in development and reduce LucasArts' working force from 450 to 190 employees. As stated, Jim Ward came from the movie business and couldn't comprehend how games could be late. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was supposed to be a multiplayer-only game, but Ward wanted a single-player campaign a few months before it was released. Everyone said that it was impossible to achieve that in such less time. Even so, pandemic and everyone at LucasArts involved in the project made it impossible, and the game met its deadline and sold extremely well, also due to its gigantic marketing campaign.
Prepare for the sequel to the best-selling Star Wars game of all time. Fight as a Jedi. Fight in space. Fight the battles any way you want. Star Wars Battlefront 2. On Tuesday, you fight again. Rated teen.
Many other rushed decisions were made in the next few years. Internally, LucasArts was seen as a madhouse run by people that weren't familiar with the development process of a video game that seemed to enjoy making huge last-minute modifications onto something that was on development for many months and even years. In 2006, LucasArts was composed by 3 development teams. Games came from third-party developers like Traveler's Tales brought LEGO Star Wars 2, and from Petroglyph Games, Star Wars Empire at War and its expansion pack Forces of Corruption. As said, by 2006, LucasArts was composed by 3 development teams, one focused on a future Indiana Jones project, another on The Force Unleashed, and the other just standing by, seeing all their concepts being crushed. Star Wars Rogue Squadron, exclusive for the Xbox. Star Wars Imperial Commando, a sequel to Republic Commando. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 3. Star Wars Jedi Knight 3 Brink of Darkness and Jedi Master. Star Wars Smuggler. Star Wars Rebel Warrior. Star Wars Darth Maul. Star Wars Proteus. Star Wars First Assault. Rogue Squadron X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, an exclusive for the Xbox 360, and Star Wars Episode 7 Shadows of the Sith. All these internal projects were cancelled during Jim Ward's leadership. Besides those, there was Star Wars Battlefront 3. The job was handed over not to Pandemic Studios, but to Free Radical, renowned by their amazing GoldenEye and Perfect Dark video games for the N64 and the Time Splitter series for the 6th generation of consoles. It was on development for 2 years and looking really good, with the premise of taking the fight from the ground to the air and space, and scheduled to be released in 2008. By that time, by February, Jim Ward stepped down as president of LucasArts, stating personal reasons, and was replaced for a couple of months by Howard Rothman. By April, Daryl Rodriguez, that came from Electronic Arts, stepped in when things started to go wrong during the development of Battlefront 3, leading to a harsh decision from LucasArts to stop funding Free Radical from missing their milestones, creating a tense working relationship between the two companies that even led Free Radical into a state of bankruptcy by the end of 2008. Even so, the Battlefront 3 project didn't die after that incident. LucasArts teamed up with developer Slant 6 Games, known for a few SOCOM titles, to create a new Star Wars Battlefront 3 from scratch, but it would also crash and burn, being vaporized in thin air. 2007 was another weak year for LucasArts, with only 2 published games from, again, third-party developers. A sequel to Thrillville, subtitled Off the Rails from Frontier Developments, and a PSP exclusive release from Rebellion Developments named Star Wars Battlefront Renegade Squadron. It wasn't until 2008 that LucasArts saw finally an internal effort being praised, with more than 7 million copies sold, becoming the fastest selling Star Wars game to that moment. Star Wars The Force Unleashed was the result of a combination of 4 concepts that were scrapped around 2005. Even so, it was supposed to be released the year before, along with a new Indiana Jones title. The problem was that LucasArts couldn't find enough programmers that knew how to develop games for the new PlayStation 3. Everyone knows that Gabe Newell from Valve publicly stated that it was a waste of time to develop games for the PS3, and that Team Ico went through hell to put The Last Guardian together while developing it for that system. And as a Sony partner, they had all the ingredients to pull it off. In consequence, half of the team working on that Indiana Jones project was moved to The Force Unleashed to get the job done for a 2007 release, pushing Indy to a 2008 release. But even so, they ran into problems going beyond 2007. So, besides the late release of Star Wars The Force Unleashed by September of 2008, a few other titles saw the light of day. Star Wars The Clone Wars Jedi Alliance, developed by LucasArts as a Nintendo DS exclusive, and Star Wars The Clone Wars Lightsaber Duels, a Wii exclusive title that takes advantage of the Wii Remote to simulate lightsaber control and a nunchuck to use Force powers. By 2009, works on the sequel to The Force Unleashed was underway, and the development team was pushed to complete it within a year. Between that, Star Wars The Clone Wars Republic Heroes was released for all systems, revealing itself as a huge flop, with some frustrating platforming elements and terrible graphics. Rebellion Developments also returned in 2009 with their new PSP and DS entry on the Star Wars universe, with the bland Battlefront Elite Squadron. LucasArts president left in May of 2010, being temporarily replaced by Jerry Bowerman from Lucasfilm Board of Directors. Later in the year, and meeting the tight deadline imposed by LucasArts executives, Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2 was released, surprisingly having its best version on the Wii. The HD versions looked really poor, like if they were rushed through development, completely failing to its high expectations. This led to layoffs within the company, and it was time for Paul Meegan to step in. By that time, BioWare was already working on the successor to Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords, a MMORPG simply named Star Wars: The Old Republic, that is gossiped around the web that it might have cost near $200 million to make, with every cent coming from BioWare's and Electronic Arts pockets, this last one working as its publisher. LucasArts made some pretty stupid calls in recent past, but the BioWare deal was the smartest move LucasArts ever made. From 2011 to 2013, LucasArts' catalog was practically non-existent, with only LEGO Star Wars 3 The Clone Wars and Star Wars The Old Republic. During that period, several plans were on the table, plans that were taking advantage of Epic Games' Unreal Engine 3. But even so, those plans were suffering constant changes. It was also by this time that George Lucas became heavily involved in all LucasArts internal projects. A new Bounty Hunter title was on development, highly inspired by the Uncharted series, most likely using the concept behind the initial cancelled HD versions of Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings. A few weeks before the 2012 edition of E3, George Lucas ordered some severe changes on that concept, that the teams behind the project only had time to rename it to Star Wars 1313, supposedly a game based on the novel Boba Fett: Maze of Deception. Fans were blown away by the demo presented at E3, and when asked directly about the game, LucasArts representatives present at the fair simply didn't know what to say about Boba Fett being the main character. It was clearly a next-gen video game targeted for PC, PS4 and Xbox One, but LucasArts didn't even confirm that. Then Paul Meegan left his present chair at LucasArts, bringing two other names in to co-lead the studio and share the same chair: Kevin Parker and Gio Corsi. Then silence struck upon LucasArts and Lucasfilm Limited, and by October 30 of 2012, Disney announced that it had acquired Lucasfilm and LucasArts, revealing also that 3 new movies were in the horizon.
Today, I am proud to announce the Walt Disney Company is acquiring Lucasfilm the global entertainment company founded by George Lucas and the home of the legendary Star Wars franchise.
Bob Iger also stated that Disney wanted to focus on social and mobile experiences over console titles, so LucasArts was foreseeing a bright new future in the hands of Disney. But unexpectedly, on April 3 of 2013, Disney announced that it was closing LucasArts. The last game released by LucasArts as a subsidiary of an independent Lucasfilm was Connect Star Wars. LucasArts ceased to operate as a video game developer, and future games based on its properties would be either developed by Disney Interactive Studios or licensed to third-party developers. LucasArts remained open with around 10 employees, retaining its function as a video game licensor after witnessing 150 staff members being laid off. Along with LucasArts, also Industrial Light and Magic lost many of its workers. Meanwhile, and as everyone knows, Electronic Arts grabbed an exclusive multi-year license to develop Star Wars games for PC and consoles, and Disney Interactive Studios would have also the right to further develop games based on that same franchise, but for mobile, social, tablet and online game markets. LucasArts, like any other developer, had a darker side. For every game released, there were 2 or 3 that never made it to players' hands. There were also, as told, a ton of Star Wars related ideas that were completely abandoned during the 90s and 2000s. It's unsure about the fate of Star Wars First Assault, but as for Star Wars 1313, Kathleen Kennedy told in an interview back in December of 2015 that the game was gold and it was something we're spending a lot of time looking at, pouring through, discussing, and we may very well develop these things further. If you've enjoyed this video, consider supporting the channel monetarily through Patreon at patreon.com/itsapixelthing or using the thanks button below. To keep up with what's going on with the channel, check all my social media stuff by clicking on the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in my next video. Cheers!